Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Education. It's 1:32 on Tuesday, March 30th. We did have a couple of cancellation today. So not that we would ever refer to the chair of the state board as filler, but it worked out for his schedule and for ours for him to come in sooner rather than later. So I appreciate that. We are going to start by hearing from Mr. Carroll as it relates to the school construction bill that the House passed over to us, and Mr. Desmarais took us through last week. Later in the week, we're going to pick this up with a lot of our usual suspects who come in to weigh in on these kinds of things. Additionally, we'll be hearing from the University of Vermont today related to their request to appropriations with federal funds coming in. We're also going to kind of close or have at least a discussion on what direction everyone wants to move in with regard to civic education. Additionally, later in the week, we're going to take up S75, and that is the bill having to do with dyslexia testing. We'll also hear from others that will be making appropriation requests related to education. So that's sort of a broad overview of the week ahead. And so with that, Mr. Carroll, wonderful to have you back. You know, we've been busy in here. We haven't been ignoring you. It's great to have you.
Yeah.
And I know that you're going to be joining us also tomorrow to talk about a possible, and you've already been in to talk to us a little bit about some requests that you're hoping we might give the green light to that might end up in a bill having coming out of government ops. But and so I think you're coming in to talk about that as well. But today we're talking about H26, which is, as a reminder, is addressing the needs and conditions of public school facilities in the state. And so if you wouldn't mind telling us your thoughts as well as the thoughts of the state board related to that bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, senators on the committee. Thank you for having me. My name is John Carroll, Chair of the State Board of Education. So about H426, a piece of any statewide initiative to move toward state assistance to capital construction of schools, I think necessarily requires a set of specifications and sort of clear rules for guiding the state in the release of funds in support of school construction, and for that matter, guiding the districts. And one piece of that that has existed for decades is something called the Capital Outlay Financing Formula. Very fancy term. It's not really about financing. It's actually about costs, which is quite a different matter. It's about the space that should be allowed for various functions. And it's not really a formula either. But other than that, the title is Capital Outlay Financing Formula. And it's about, in its most recent iteration, which dates back to 2008, it's about 10 or 15 pages of fairly dense tables describing how many square feet one needs in a music room at the middle school level per student. How many square feet for the storage of fresh vegetables at the cafeteria. So it's a whole set of, if you will, rubrics about what ought to be the sort of space standards for schools. And it differentiates between high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. And then it goes on to make statements about construction costs per square foot that would be allowable. It does not, however, address construction specifications. That is to say, it doesn't speak about how many air changes per hour the ventilation system should provide. It doesn't speak about what our values should be captured in the walls and the windows or anything like that. That is done in a different part of the work, typically conducted under the jurisdiction of the Agency of Education. Traditionally, the capital outlay formula has been part of the state board's rulemaking authority with regard to school construction. And so the House called me in to ask me if the state board would be prepared to update, if you will, the capital formula. I said yes, but it's way beyond our capabilities. It's the sort of thing that requires the expertise of architects and engineers who really know their stuff, especially who know current standards, current costs, who know national standards, best practices, and so forth. The state board, as you know, is a group of lay people by design, by intention. We're not supposed to be expert at anything, even education. We're supposed to be thoughtful people who look at educational issues. I have to confess that when Senator Campion introduced this, he asked me to share my views and the views of the board, and I have to confess that they're a little bit different. I think perhaps I could say I got out over my skis a little bit by saying, yes, we'd be happy to do this. That's probably because I have 30 years of experience in construction and construction management, and I kind of love that stuff. It's catnip to me. But to most people, it's crushingly boring and opaque. And that's sort of what my board conveyed to me, which was, well, maybe you'd like to do that, John, but we think not only do we not have any expertise, but we don't have very much bandwidth, and it would be better for this work to be done by others. Even though the House bill dedicated $100,000 to the board for the purposes of retaining the architectural consultants and engineers that would be needed to do this work. And I had insisted upon that. I knew that we lay people couldn't possibly do this work with any effectiveness. And there happened at the time to be a representative from one of the major architectural firms in the state. And he verified to the House committee that 100,000 was probably about the right number. Seems like a big nut, but it's quite a lot of work. Anyway, my board, when I reported all this to my board last meeting, and remember, we only meet once a month, and I can't call everybody up and say, what do you think, without violating the Public Information Act. When I reported this to the board, they said, gee, we'd rather not do this. We feel like we don't know much about it. We feel already overwhelmed. So I talked with Secretary French, who would be the next logical, the agency would be the next logical entity to do this. And in some ways, quite a bit more logical than the state board, in the sense that at this time, as we foresee the state possibly implementing a state aid to construction program for schools, the agency is going to ramp up their capability, which they used to have a robust capability, which kind of slowly dissipated as the state aid program also disappeared now for well over a decade. And Secretary French said, yes, we can take that on. We would need that 100K funding in order to do so, because we don't have that expertise in-house, but we do hope to have people on staff who can manage that kind of thing, manage a contract of that scope and cost. And so I wrote this morning to the chair to say that the board respectfully requests that the duties with regard to the capital financing formula be to request that you amend 426 section 2B, which relates to this, amended by saying that it shall be the Agency of Education that would conduct this work, not the state board. So that's where our request stands, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Committee, any questions about making this shift from the state board to the Agency of Education? Senator Hooker.
So, thank you, Senator Campion. And Mr. Carroll, there would be no increase in the request for funds?
Not that I know of. It would, I guess, our sense from the gentleman from Truex Collins was that that was an adequate amount for a lay board such as us, where we would have to contract out all the work.
Okay.
So my guess would be that it ought to be an adequate amount for the agency, but that's frankly not for me to say.
Okay. But there's a possibility that it could even be less, maybe?
I
don't
can't
know.
say.
Okay. The agency. Thank you.
One of the things that I've been grappling a little bit with in this new role, and I think some of my colleagues have been as well, and this is somewhat related to your request, and that is this, the agency itself and the people power, and where is it in terms of what it's able to do versus what we really need it to do, and whether or not it's urban legend that we have been slowly but surely over many administrations decreasing the people power in the agency, and if so, what are the realistic needs, and how can we assess those needs and get to where we need to be to fulfill all of the roles, responsibilities, requests that we continue to ask of them, and really are, the kind of work that they are all called to do and want to do. One example of this is when we asked for the folks who are working on civic education to come in, they came in, and then when asked for the people on foreign languages, it's the same people, and it's the same people on some of these other topics. So as the chair of the state board, I wonder if you might, if I know I'm just have a brief conversation with us around that. If that's a concern of yours, how are you feeling about it? I realize I'm kind of popping this question to you, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. It's just, it is related to some of the conversations that we're having right now.
It's a good question, and I guess it's obviously the answer is not easy, else
Sure.
would have been answered by now. Some strands of thought that come up. I guess the big picture is that the Agency of Education's relationship to education is profoundly different than, let us say, the Development Department's relationship is to development, or the Tax Department is to taxes, in the sense that the agency oversees a highly decentralized cadre of teachers, educators, school board members, janitors, school bus drivers, cafeteria workers, special education assistants, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Vermonters are actually doing the work of education. Mm-hmm. And they have actually the local expertise, and right. So that the agency's oversight of this is very different than the agency of Department of Finance oversight of its tax attorneys, who are employees of the state, and they are directly answerable there too. So you have this, frankly, it's unique among all the agencies in the state, where you've got a centralized bureaucracy that takes its marching orders from you folks, who has to somehow deploy all that guidance and information out into the real world of 12,000 people who were hired by somebody else, not by the agency. And I happen personally to respect that arrangement a great deal. I think it's a core tradition of Vermont life, not just education. I mean, we are a state that values its small communities and local ownership and responsibility for our own governance. So I don't have any desire to see a great centralization of educational authority in Montpelier, especially if it's at the expense of communities' autonomy and their own wisdom. That, having said that, there's enormous variability, if you will, in the quality of what happens in the communities and the schools. And there's just no getting around it that the range of methods and quality is highly variable. In addition to a background in construction, I come from a background in continuous improvement, and a test of quality is eliminating variation. In a quality organization, variation is the enemy of quality. So we've got this contradiction of objectives and design on the one hand, and the secretary has put out a proposal that all school districts be eliminated. I think there's a House bill to this effect. This comes up every year. There are those who think that's a great idea to streamline policy, and there are those like me who think it's absolutely antithetical to what it means to be a Vermonter. To get back more to the agency itself, I think there are a lot of factors at work. One is, I think it's difficult for agency people to get out of Montpelier or Barre or wherever they're located and get into the schools and know what's really happening. It's understandably difficult. I think the quality of the agency employees varies considerably, I think just as it does in any organization, including the state senate and certainly any corporation and any other agency. From our perspective on the state board, there are times when we feel that the agency is not doing a good enough job. If we were to be talking about independent schools, for example, I would say to you that the quality of oversight that we rely upon from the agency is not as robust as we see it in other settings. On the other hand, there's no doubt that agency employees are spread very, very thin. I think their head count, I don't know the facts on this, but my impression is that the head count is appreciably down. We've lost as many state employees as we've lost students, at least percentage-wise, probably more, over the last 20 years. So when the secretary says, well, I just don't have the people to do this, I'm sure that there's merit to that. How would you approach this? What approach might be to bring in an outside, I may be struck dead for this, management consultant, somebody who has a dispassionate understanding of how effective organizations work, and look at the agency. You could do this with any agency. You could do that with my state board. We could always do it better, and we're not usually our smartest self-critics. It might be worth taking a look at what is the agency supposed to do, and how effectively is it doing it, and is it deploying its human power where it needs to be. Every organization I've ever worked with has a certain inertia. You hear about this is the way it's always been done.
Sure.
So I've talked enough.
No, that's helpful. Senator Lyons and then Senator Chinden, please.
No, you haven't talked enough. You just answered you made the same comment that I was going to make, which is an assessment of the organization through either the eyes of the board or other eyes that have an understanding of what goes on in other states, to determine whether or not the agency has the staffing, the organizational structure, and the communication systems that are needed to oversee such a disparate system that you're talking about. So I'm really pleased to hear you say that, and I think that is probably something that is way long and coming. So,
Yes.
And I'm wondering, actually, Mr. Chair, if as we look at ESSER funds, and that I'm wondering if there might be some funding available, because look, this whole agency and the system within the state has been through some really difficult times, and we've identified gaps and needs. it would seem to me that ESSER funding or other federal funding would fully support this type of analysis. So that's my thinking on that. And I
It's great thinking.
can't answer the question. The other thing that you brought up is not having centralized policy. I don't know that you use policies, but the one thing that continues to bug me and from time to time is the need for a set of principles. I know we say, oh, we have state standards for, curriculum and so on. But there have to be some principles that we put in place and values that we have in place that are consistent regardless of what school system you're in. And I've asked this question before of when Ted Fisher was into, I forget, I think it was a prevention discussion that we had in health and welfare with a joint hearing with a meeting with a House committee, I think it was last year. And or 2 years ago, because it was non-pandemic, asking about whether or not there are a series of policies or principles that we have in place that are guidance for all of our districts, separate from the state standards. So I always, Vermont is Vermont, our Vermont values, and they're, for me, I'm very disturbed when I see a lack of consistency from one district to the next. And I don't care what it is. I mean, so now we're fixing some of those things by identifying literacy or identifying some of the other work that we've done this year. So I think some proactive consideration of what might improve the system as a whole. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize. I think you have to understand that I'm a systems person, so that's where it goes. Anyway, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that from the state board's perspective.
Thank you.
Senator Chin, did you want to jump? Is it related? Do you want to jump in now? Go
It's
ahead.
actually very, very related. So Senator Lyons, I hope that this rings true with what you were just saying. And I agree, we can't get enough of Mr. Carroll's time. I think you touched upon the core issue with how we fund education in Vermont. We want we demand equal access to educational opportunities, but at the same time, we want to maintain local control to decide priorities. So that's an inherent conflict to trust the local control and deciding what that community thinks needs to happen while at the same time having equal opportunities. And that's where in my naive perspectives running for city council, whenever the school budget came up, I always said the issue is that Act 60 centralized funding, but left decision-making decentralized. Now, I support and understand where you're coming from a local control, but with the mandates that are coming at us, I feel like Senator Lyons, and I'd love to hear your reaction to this, is circling where my mind is settling on not the solution, but the path, which is state standards, where if the state couples with new funding says you must have this amount of square footage for indoor gym space, and it must meet these requirements. And so we have to be more specific, and that's state control, that's centralization. But I think it's necessary to achieve equitable access to educational opportunities in the climate we're in. But I'd love to hear your reaction to that, sir.
Oh, thank you. I was trying to explain this to some folks a while ago, and I went back to our Constitution, which I happen to love the more I've gotten to take the time to study it. And it is unique, I think, among all constitutions in its insistence that every community shall have a school for the convenient education of youth, quote unquote. And so from the get-go, our founders saw that education was fundamental to the success of democracy. I mean, these people were thinking, how do we make this new thing called democracy work, as they were in Philadelphia? And so our Constitution stipulates that about schools as essential to all communities. At the same time, we have Brigham and the state Supreme Court's great wisdom about that the quality of education a child gets should not be an accident of the place of its birth. That is to say that there ought to be equal educational opportunities statewide. So that's that kind of tension, if you will. I don't think it's necessarily a conflict, but I grant that it is a tension. It's only a conflict if we let it be a conflict, I think. We make it a conflict. Anyway, so I can see the case to be made that when left to their own devices, the variability among school districts causes there to be variability of educational opportunity as a result. And so Brigham seems to me is saying to us more than something about funding. I think it's saying something about, well, frankly, the quality of the delivery of the education that's actually delivered on the classroom floor in the 273 schools in the state, or whatever the number is. And so this goes back to, I think, Senator Lyons is thinking about, and I guess as you were writing, Senator, I was sort of sketching a little hierarchy of principles. And I think the Constitution is certainly all about principles. But beyond that, we can talk about principles, and from which ultimately, hopefully, policies come. Policies normally are expressed in the form of statute, the action of your body. From that typically come rules. Almost every agency does their own rules. In the case of education, the rules are done by the state board. The agency sends out a lot of guidelines. But and the guidelines set forth best practices, but it's interesting, Senator Shin, you raised the point about that we're very specific about how many square feet you need for a music room, but we won't tell you what textbook to use, let alone we won't even tell you what to teach. And that's a kind of a contradiction of sorts that seems to be okay with, I mean, the communities are willing to accept your standards about air changes per hour. They're not going to argue with you about that, but they are going to insist upon that we know better what to teach our students than you do. And I don't know how we start to work our way through this tension so that we bring about more consistency in the quality of education that's available, except possibly that the gap between guidelines on the one hand and practices on the ground on the other is where the gap is. All schools are receive the same, presumably best practices guidelines. Some schools observe them, in fact, even exceed them, and other schools disregard them for various reasons. So one of the questions gets to be, how do you ensure consistent performance vis-a-vis the guidelines we already have?
So what you've brought up is a really critical point. And today we have data-informed practices. And so what you have just said is, regardless of whether those data-informed practices are supported through the guidelines, schools can ignore them. And so the reality is then that this committee of this body as a legislature needs to pass a bill on literacy or school discipline. And the inefficiency of that system to me is just unfortunate. So how can we put in place up front some of the, maybe not quite the detail of the square footage where the conductor has to stand for the music room, but at least guidelines that are enforceable through the agency. And I'll stick with the agency, not the board, but how can we enforce those to ensure that our kids are getting equitable educational opportunities, and then we're seeing equitable outcomes?
Well, good question. And I think what we're talking about is a school accountability. That is to say, to what extent are schools operating accountably with response to it, in response to the guidelines that are presented to them? I don't think it's a problem of that the legislature needs to be more specific or more prescriptive. I think it's more a problem of where the rubber meets the road. That is to say, we're not even doing what it is schools have been asked to do on a consistent basis. So we can ask them to do more, and that's simply going to, I think, widen the gap between what they've been asked and what they do. Rather, I think we need to, I mean, that is to say the General Assembly could ask them to do more, could be more prescriptive about a civics course or anything else. But the question is, how do we make that materialize on the ground? And that gets to the question of school accountability. And to my impression is that this goes back to the agency and what it does. If you had just the private sector model, if you had a company with sort of management in Barrie and 10 manufacturing facilities scattered around the state, and they were all supposed to be doing pretty much the same thing with their own raw materials, and you found some were doing it well and some were not doing it well, what you'd probably want to do is go visit those folks a lot. And you'd like to stand in their classrooms and talk to their department heads and sort of get into the weeds with them about the state expects you to do this, but you seem to be doing that. How do we change that? So I guess what I'm suggesting is that a vital role for the agency is to get into the schools and to be the eyes and ears of policy and to coach and to guide and to teach, to bring about this conformance. And I think if I haven't done this, but if you ask the agency, how much time do your people spend in schools? I expect the number is quite small.
Yeah.
So, but you just circled back to the original suggestion of evaluating and assessing the agency's capacity to
Yeah.
do exactly what you just said. Yeah, no, it is a,
And it almost
That's
even gets
important.
into a definition of the mission of the agency.
yes.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
You know, it's not enough to do guidelines. It's enough, it's imperative that they or somebody walk with those guidelines into a school building and be there for
Yeah.
3 weeks.
Senator Chittenden.
So I just want to follow up with something I think I just heard you say, Mr. Carroll, is you said that you don't necessarily see it as the state enacting more guidelines to address these equity concerns. Well, here's my concern with S13, with the reweighting. Say we rebalance, we will adjust the weighting so that the schools get a different funding formula, and then schools that will benefit more could make local decisions and all of a sudden stand up fabulous foreign languages programs where they teach Chinese and Russian and all of the languages under the sun. And that's where they choose to commit their resources. But our maths, sciences, our college placements and other things suffer. Then won't we still have that same discussion 10, 15 years from now when those schools aren't achieving or through the results the same equitable access to education because it wasn't coupled with some statewide standards?
Well, I guess my thought would be that to back to where you started, which was that Act 60 and the court's decision in Brigham appeared to be about money, but we're not looking at how the money is getting used. So all schools have kind of, in theory, a fair amount of money that will be fixed a little bit with S13, I hope. But I think it's really about practices on the ground. It's about how some school boards have this attitude about education and other schools have that attitude. And 100 years ago, differential attitudes maybe made some sense. If you were in a town that was a sawmill town and they were all it was logging and making lumber, well, that's what people needed to know how to do. But today, Vermont towns are comparatively homogeneous. Almost everybody in most towns commutes to work in some other town, and the economies are not so differentiated as they once were. And so the local variability is less defensible today than it was. But in any case, I think we can mess around with the formula till the cows come home. And if we don't find ways to move schools into best practices and data-informed practices, we won't change what's happening on the ground in classrooms. You could write a curriculum the way they do in Texas. You could specify the textbook, but if you don't have a mechanism to enforce that, keeping in mind that we are constitutionally a decentralized system with all of these people are hired locally or elected locally. None of them are chosen by the Agency of Education. So it's really, it's like having 68 autonomous companies and you're just sending them funding, but you're not really telling them exactly what to do. And you couldn't get away with telling them exactly what to do. You have to, I guess you have to go there and you have to convince them. I don't know.
No, this is very helpful, and I think Senator Lyons and Senator Chittenden's questions have been great, and Senator Lyons' suggestion to consider this audit, I think, given that we have some funds right now, and given that I think we're all feeling a need to get a handle on what's there and what direction we might want to go in, with your help, your board's help, and the agency's help, I think makes a lot of sense.
I should just clarify that I'm speaking only for myself. I've not been
Too
I have
late.
not vetted these
Late.
remarks with the
Too
state board. And there'll be some who don't see it the way I do, which is part of the power of our board. There's diversity of points of view.
No, I appreciate that, absolutely. And if we were to certainly move in that direction, we would have you back in to represent the board's position. And but this conversation and it has been very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Any other questions for Mr. Carroll? Okay.
If I may, I could give
Please.
you, is there a
Absolutely.
moment?
Yes, please.
I could give you an illustration of a place where I, at least, and I think some board members share this, wish the agency could be kind of more out in the weeds. And this relates to independent schools, independent school approval. The method that's used for independent school approval, by and large, is the agency will send a couple people out for less than a day and visit a school, come back to us and say, here's what we found. We recommend approval for another 5 years. In contrast, some schools instead have NEASC, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, come and visit them. And if NEASC recommends to the state board that this school complies with its standards, we sign off on that. So there's two ways you can be visited and overseen. One is by the state agency, and the other is by NEASC. When NEASC does it, they send a team of, I guess, typically 4 to 6, sometimes even 8 educators who visit the school for a week. Just counting the hours involved, let alone the talent that's being brought to bear, you can see that a NEASC oversight of a school applying to be approved is vastly richer than what we get from the agency. And it's rich not only because it tells us more, but it informs the schools. Any school that has had a NEASC visit will tell you it was enormously productive, and the learning on the part of the school was very rich and lasting. And this, by the way, is some of our public high schools. Rutland High School has had NEASC visits for years. And Dave Walk, who's an old friend of mine, always raves about the value of having 4 to 6 outside educators come in and see the school through a different lens. That's the kind of really rich engagement that can happen and can really move the needle for schools and give the state more confidence in its approvals.
Senator Hooker.
With regard to that, Chair Carroll, I know that when I was teaching and the school that I was teaching at was undergoing NEASC, there was also preparation for it, which made the school look at what they were doing and seeing that perhaps there were places that they needed to improve. So I think an ESC type of oversight or review is an interesting place to go. And maybe that's something that we should look at as well.
Yeah, very interesting.
Well, you've been very kind to allow me to talk. Thank you.
No, we appreciate it very much. We got a lot out of it. So thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll
Are
be
you
in touch.
expecting me tomorrow?
I may have misspoken. I know Senator White wants to come in, I believe,
Yeah.
tomorrow to talk about some of the things that the two of you've come to speak to us about, and maybe there's a vehicle for some of this work to happen in a bill in government ops. And I thought I saw an email where she would like to bring you along, but I perhaps misspoke. But I'll try to dig that up, and Jeannie and I
Yeah.
will be in touch. If
I can join you if you wish.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank
good
you all.
afternoon.
Thanks for this conversation.
Committee, the president of UVM won't be here until 2:30. So we'll take a stretch break. And if you can come back a little bit before 2:30 for President Garamella, that would be great. And then we'll move on. We'll continue on this discussion with Jeff Fannin, and then we'll have a civic education conversation before we wrap up. Thank you.